So, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining Disruptive Learning, Demystifying Technology and Enabling People to Use AI, brought to you by Insignia Training Partners. My name is Bernie DeSantis, and I'm the CEO of Insignia Training Partners. We are a training broker organization that connects companies with the right talent, content, and resources to be able to design, develop, and deploy training courses, programs, and virtual events such as this. I will be your producer today, so if you run into any technical challenges with Zoom, please feel free to reach out to me directly into the chat. I'll also drop my contact information into the chat if you'd like to connect with me. Now, we do intend for this to be an interactive and engaging event, so please feel free to drop your comments into the chat or questions into the Q&A. We will do our best to weave them into the conversation or address them towards the end of the webinar. Please be sure to participate in the polling activity that we have as we proceed. And lastly, please do be advised that we are recording today's event. So with that, please allow me to introduce Dr. Ashwin Mehta, founder of Methodology, an AI and technology strategy consultancy. He's also a fractional chief learning officer and a learning and development AI strategist. Also, Paul Carney, a banking CHRO, AI prompt engineering expert, and the founder of Perpeta to lead our discussion today. So with that, gentlemen, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Bernie, and thank you for having us. I'll probably speak on behalf of both of us, right, Paul?
That's right.
Yeah. So I'll kick off then. Let's first of all set the context for where we are. So thank you, Bernie, and thank you everybody for joining today. The context of why we're actually talking about this. So we're talking about the idea of demystifying the disruption that's all around us. But what is that disruption? Let's just have a little bit of a chat about that. So we are in the situation now where we've had 2 years, ballpark 2 years, of disruption from the moment the ChatGPT entered our lives, entered the public domain, and everybody could use it. From then through to now, we've had a market of tools that has diverged and converged. It's grown and then it's shrunk again, and it's carried on doing this. And we have this idea that effectively, because the market landscape is changing daily, not only from foundational models, but also from all of the tools that are available to us, we have a little bit of chaos. It's kind of difficult to keep up with what's happening, but also it's difficult to keep up with what we should be doing. So I'll focus on both those things in this idea of context, what's out there and what should we be doing. But it's not only about AI in software tools. We have phones in our pockets, right? Everybody who comes to work has got a device that potentially is AI capable. And most people have in that device the capability to access things via browser or access things via applications. So we also have a sprawling security and privacy and ownership and authentication issue where workers can access company-wide AI systems, things that are implemented deliberately, or workers can access things that are just in their pocket if they want to find out something. And because we have that capability, we therefore have this disruption to L&D, because in the learning and development arena, we have the traditional paradigm where learning and development was the hub for learning. So we had departments that would make content and that would stick that content on a system. And when a worker would access that content because they needed to or because they were mandated to, then that interaction itself would produce some data and then some reporting could happen on that. And now we're much more in a stage where everybody can access anything whenever they want to because the trigger comes from the person. So when we're thinking about knowledge work, we're thinking about I need to know something, and that presents me with a trigger to go and find something out. And therefore, I can just go and find it out. And I can ask an AI agent, or I can just go on YouTube and I can just find out what I want. And that disruption means that the L&D department is not really the center of learning anymore. It's democratized. It's part of everybody's onus to develop themselves and to find out and to problem solve. With that, we also have the convergence of user interfacing. So we have lots of tools out there, but all of these tools kind of look the same. They kind of work in the same way. So the barrier from switching from one tool that you're familiar with to another tool that you're familiar with has gone away. So now people who have access to devices and they have access to lots of different AI tools, they also don't have the barrier from switching from one thing to another. So keeping up with what's actually happening and how people are learning and how people are accessing information becomes increasingly difficult. And because it's increasingly difficult, and because the technology landscape is also increasingly difficult to keep up with, we now have the problem of scrutiny. So how does an L&D department or an HR department now justify their existence, how justify the budgets they are spending, and justify in terms of data what the population in an organization is actually doing? So this is the contextual problem that we are dealing with. And in the landscape of tools, we have various categories that we can start to think about. So to pivot slightly from the context of the problem towards the idea of demystification, we have, and I'm just going to break this down very, very simply so that everybody's able to participate in the discussion in the same way. We have foundational models. We have things like ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini that are built to allow us to access those foundational models. So things like GPT, for example, GPT-4 would be the foundational model, and we access that through ChatGPT. So we have access to these things. We also have access to marketplaces where we can make our own AI systems. So we could be looking at the AWS and Microsoft Azure environments, or we could be looking at things like Hugging Face and Make and U.com and these things where you can effectively daisy chain bits of functionality together. In the L&D space, however, we're much more likely to either use a foundational model to go back and forth, and this is the idea of prompt engineering, which Paul will talk about in more detail, or we have the option to build something which may be a fine-tuned model or using retrieval augmented generation, or we have the option to use a wide variety of software as a service tools to make images. So we could be looking at things like Midjourney or DALL-E. We have the possibility of making potentially videos. So we could be looking at things like Runway. We have the possibility to use avatar tools. So we could be looking at Colossian or Synthesia or Owl One and things like that. We could be looking at translations and audio, so 11 Labs and DeepL. We could be looking at the whole host of creative suites, so things like Adobe Creative Cloud, where we have the option to generate images and then modify images and things like that. Or we could be looking at productivity tools, Notion, Perplexity, Loop, all of these kinds of things. So we have some categorization which we can apply to the market to try and sort of demystify it and try and simplify it a little bit. But then comes the problem of what are we actually going to do? What's our purpose? Why are we actually here, right? So when we start thinking about why we actually here, it's very different. Thinking about me as a person, I want to go and play with AI, great, because everybody else is doing it, and maybe I'm curious, and maybe I want to go into this as a field, or whatever your personal kind of motivation is. But the personal motivation is very different to if you're in an organization and you're thinking of investing money, you're thinking of investing time, you want to build something, right? Because if you're doing that, then the natural question is nearly always going to be, well, what are we going to get from this? We're going to put some money in and we're going to get something out. What's the outcome that we want? So that kind of leads me onto a little bit of an approach, right? Because the market is sprawling, we've got the devices, we've got this effectively this idea of an uncontrollable surge of learning. So how do we start to make some sense out of that? Well, in an enterprise sense, things are slightly different. And they're slightly different when we think about any implementation of tech. It doesn't really have to be AI, just be any implementation of investable technology. So usually we want to think about, well, what's the business problem that we're actually trying to solve? There's a problem and I want to solve it by applying some technology. If that's not true, then don't apply the technology. Because if you don't have any problems in your business, then great, go forth and make money. But if you have business problems, of course, then you want to address those things. And it could be that you have problems in your sales activities, and you want to, increase the capability of your salespeople to open conversations or to close conversations or whatever that happens to be. It might be something that you want to reduce the cost base of content development. These are all valid problems to have, but it's helpful to articulate that problem and then to think about what a purposeful and meaningful implementation of something that is an investment of time, effort, trouble, money, all of these things, what that actually looks like. And it could be you build something, it could be you buy something, but whatever it is, you should have some measurable success criteria to go along with that. But addressing a problem on its own, just maybe that isn't enough, because maybe you need to have some kind of governance structure. Maybe you need to be thinking about privacy and security and all of these things as well. So that would effectively be the high level way to think about the categorization that I've already outlined that demystifies the market a little bit. And this is now a way to demystify the process of implementation because we think we want to do something, but we want to do it in a kind of structured way. So we're not just flapping around trying to implement something or just playing around with something that doesn't really have a purpose. So purpose, strategy, what are we doing? Why should we be doing it? Governance, how do we do it responsibly? Then we have the technology piece, which I've already talked about, but we have a sprawling landscape that we want to make sense out of. And for that, we really want to be thinking again in the L&D space. How do we apply technology or digital learning to some kind of pedagogy that we have designed that is purposeful, that maybe looks at some kind of behavioral, cognitive, or motivational outcome? Assuming, of course, we are in this traditional paradigm of L&D where we make content and we put it on an infrastructure and then we get some data. But what if we're not doing that? What if we're doing something slightly different? We could be thinking about co-piloting. So this is where our learners themselves have access to some kind of model. And if that's true, that's a transformational paradigm rather than just making content. But just to bring that back home, we have people accessing information on a system, and when they access it, they produce some data. That data itself can be very rich. So in the traditional LMS paradigm, we might be looking at the idea of timestamped completion, or some kind of vanity metrics like web traffic or how many people clicked on X. But when we start to think about people going back and forth with an AI model, then we start to think about very rich and granular behavioral data because we can capture sentiment, we can capture trends, we can capture things that people have been working on or people have been asking particular questions about. So that starts to be quite rich. But all of this requires, of course, data, data management, data hygiene, and data literacy, which is very important. And data is so important because it is the fuel for the AI engine. So where data is the fuel for the AI engine, we need to also turn the lens inwards and think about, well, where's my data? How is it being handled? How's it being stored? Is it to the right quality? Is it tagged correctly? Do we have appropriate levels of management? Can we get insight out of our data? Can we evaluate it such that we know it's reliable and we know what the sources are? So all of these questions start to arise. And alongside data literacy, of course, comes AI literacy. So we need to be aware of things like prompting, things like retrieval augmented generation, things like fine tuning, but also things like how do we scrutinize our suppliers to make sure that we're getting the right solutions for our business? How do we make sure that they're doing the right things in terms of governance? So all of that starts to come into play as well. And that leads us down a path of having a culture of data skills, a culture of AI, but also a culture of innovation and a culture of entrepreneurship where people can go and try things and test things and they have the permission to do so. And when people have the permission to innovate and people have the permission to experiment, they will inevitably solve problems and come up with really interesting things. So all of that together, I'll summarize, right? So we need to have a business problem strategy. We need to have appropriate governance in place, leadership and roles, but also things like security and privacy to make sure that whatever we're implementing is going to be done responsibly, doesn't put anybody at risk. And ethics comes into play in that as well. We need to have the technology. We need to have some kind of data management structure in place. And we need to also have the skills, data, AI, and the available culture in our organization to make all of that work. Now, tangible example. Let's think about a tangible example. So I want to make a video. I want to make a video with a particular tool, whatever that tool is. So I should be thinking about why I'm doing this. I made 100 videos last year and now I want to make 1,000. Fine. It's a reason. If that's your reason, great. If you were doing text and you want to move towards video, of course, that's another reason. So have a reason for doing it. You would then look at available AI video tools if that's what you want to do. And you would be thinking about, well, if I'm making videos of people, then do I need to get ownership? If I'm making videos of stock footage, do I need to think about copyright? Am I putting company data into these tools? Do I need to think about security? So you'd go through some kind of governance process and think about where you need to get authorizations in your company and are you adhering to your company policies? The data side of things, you're probably looking at a tool that's already been pre-trained on lots of video and lots of images. So maybe you don't need that much in the way of data because you're not deploying that. But when you deploy it to your learners, you probably want to have some kind of understanding of whether or not they're consuming that video or interacting with it in some way. And you would need the skills in your L&D department to use those tools to make videos. So, very quick example of going through that kind of approach in a systematic way that allows us to not only understand the context of the problem, but in a very simple way allows us to deploy something with purpose. I will pause there. Paul, I've said a lot of things about prompt engineering. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, wow, you covered a lot of stuff there, and you've probably got everyone really thinking, which is great because that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Is get them thinking about this. They're probably already thinking about it a little bit, but and I love your context of yeah. So what these L&D leaders are everyone in L&D right now is facing is a lot of what you just mentioned, which is they're being bombarded with tools, they're being bombarded with systems and all these things saying, okay, this will do this for you, this will do that for you. But as you said, unless you figure out what am I trying to solve, what am I trying to do, it's going to be totally different. So I love the concept. I get this a lot from folks who say, great, we use, I'll get people to say, we use it. And I don't know if Bernie, if you wanted to pop up a poll, we had a poll that was going to ask about people's levels of use. There it is. So if you want to just quickly, those of you out there can go ahead and vote which level you're at, comfort level with the AI technology. That'll help us understand a little bit of who you are and where you are in the thing. And don't be afraid to mark that last one. That was one of those I put on there because there are some people who are in that mode, and you'll probably see that there are a few that are okay. It's okay, as I say in my speeches, that you can be at that level because it can happen. People may be in that certain mode. So go ahead and vote one of the choices there of where you are today with that. And as you're voting, one of the things I want to mention that we're talking about here is that choice, right? There's so much. I used to say this to my kids when the internet came along, when the web came along, and said, I don't want to hear that you can't, don't know something because you can go Google it, right? Back in the day, it was Ask Jeeves and Yahoo, but today it's Google. Again, today, if you don't know someone or something's not there, you've got access to information today that's amazing. So great. So we don't have anyone afraid and on the run. I love it. And it looks like we're about 50-50 split between somewhat comfortable use it and then using it every day. So that's awesome because here's where I use this analogy when you're going to help, as Dr. Mehta said, about trying to put people in front of these tools and what are you going to do with them. You can sit down and give someone a blank canvas and a whole bunch of paints and some paintbrushes. But if you don't train them how to do it, they're going to have an output. They're going to paint something for you. But if you don't train them on what they should be doing, techniques and those types of things, it's not going to be as effective. That's the ROI he was talking about. And I think the same thing's true and I'll just stick with right now large language models and using them to do creative things or help with emails. If you're not training your folks on how to effectively use these, it's going to be a wild west. As he mentioned, right, is what are you going to get? Are you even tracking what are they getting for outputs? What are they doing there? So guiding people, this concept of prompt engineering or prompt design is really important. And that's what L&D teams need to start looking at is how are we helping them understand how to structure these prompts to get effective information, validate the information, make sure it's correct, source it to make sure it's accurate. Because again, remember, these things are called generative AI engines. They're made to create, they take a bunch of unstructured data and create new data from it or new information, new content. That's good in some cases, but you got to be careful. I'm sure everyone's heard the concept of the lawyer who went to a court with a case that was made up. He asked ChatGPT, but the problem was it wasn't that he lied. People say, "Oh, the ChatGPT lied." No, it didn't. What happened was his prompt was bad. He didn't say. He said, "Hey, I got this argument I'm making for this court case. Give me a case that supports my argument." So it generated a beautiful case that supported his argument. He failed to say, cite the source, show me the actual case, because then it was said, oh no, I made it up, which it does. So it was a prompt failure on his case because he didn't know how to prompt it effectively. And that's the part I think with L&D, as we talk about prompt design, that you got to keep these things in mind. How you help people understand what these engines can and can't do. They're not really good at reasoning, even though ChatGPT will tell you it's got a reasoning model now. I have tested it extensively, and what it looks like it's doing for reasoning. It's just doing multi-stepped prompt. It's kind of interacting with itself, which is good, but it's not technically reasoning. And you probably heard the count the number of R's in strawberry, and about a month ago, it couldn't answer that for you because it didn't know the word strawberry. It knows strawberry as a fruit, as a color, and the textures, but it doesn't know the word. I think ChatGPT, I think the folks at OpenAI actually went out and took every English word now and put on that how many letters. So if you ask it, it's going to tell you, but it's only because it's been trained on that. It doesn't know the word itself. So when people understand that better, when you help them understand it, they get more out of it. I say this in my speeches that dealing with these LLMs, these large language models, on any chat thing, whether you're using it, whether it's built into a tool like Adobe or Microsoft's Copilot or Gemini or in ChatGPT, Perplexity, no matter which ones you're dealing with, they all come down to that prompt. It's asking you, what do you want? I jokingly say that you have to treat it like it's the smartest 7-year-old you're ever going to encounter, because it thinks it knows everything, but it does not. It lacks worldly context and experience. It's going to, you have to be very direct and specific with it. Changing one word in a prompt will get you very different results. I've posted this on LinkedIn before that show changing the word cheap to cost effective gets you very different results, because while we may think cheap and cost effective is the same word, the LLM does not, because the context of the word cheap means $0 typically. Cost effective says I'll spend some money, but I want to get good value for it. And then the third reason is it'll make things up if it doesn't know anything, which is cool, because when you really think about all of those characteristics, like it's a smart 7-year-old, you can actually create prompts that will drive that. So for instance, on the making things up, ChatGPT has a thing for those programmers like us that we can set the temperature, but you don't need to even be that specific. You can say on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is don't make anything up, 10 is make up as much as you want, be as creative as you want, set it to a 3. I mean, you can give it that instruction in your prompt and it will understand you. So there's a lot of things like that. And one of the quick things I'll mention is we mentioned privacy, authenticity. There's also the bias. The data sets are biased. Humans are all biased. The data sets are biased because there's only so much data in each of these large language models. And the programmers who actually do, as you mentioned, the RAG concept, the training these models with data and context, also have biases. So there's a lot of biases there. But does that mean, we all have biases, but does that mean we run away from talking or dealing with each other? No, we don't. The key is to understand them and minimize them. So one of the ways I tell people, and I get this all the time, is to say, I didn't know you could do that. So at the end of you ask ChatGPT for something, and at the end of it, when it gives you the results, you can say, okay, especially as HR people, identify 3 possible biases in your results. Give me a 3 to 4 sentence description of each bias and how it may impact my decision. You're asking the engine to now identify its own biases and report those to you. That's powerful. We can't do that. There's not many systems in the world we can do that with. We've never had access to do stuff like that. You typically wouldn't ask another person their biases and tell you to explain them. They probably may not understand them, and if they did, they probably aren't going to tell you. But these engines will do that. So that's, again, another way to use these things that you as HR, leadership and development, talent development folks need to help these people understand. So I hope I've made my point about the why you need to be doing this. Great article the other day. One last point, interactional expertise. And that's this one guy wrote an article talking about that's what we should be training people to do. Dr. Mehta mentioned that a little bit about the trying, giving them permission and giving them the ability to try things. This guy did an experiment. He had 9 students who were not software developers. He put them through a 1-semester course. He's a professor. And in the end, they developed websites that were amazing. And one of the students even said, she goes, I think I can gaslight a recruiter to make them think I'm a software developer based on what I was able to learn from these engines. So that's he calls it the interactional expertise. That's what we want to be teaching people. How do you're not going to become an expert using ChatGPT. That's not going to happen, but you can develop enough knowledge to be able to talk with someone about a topic if you learn how to do it well. So anyways, I love that concept. It's wide open right now, and it's going to change. The engines are changing constantly. As we mentioned, there's so many products coming and going, and it's going to continue to evolve, which is great, but we've got to start now, especially on the how to communicate with these engines, how to get the most out of them. The better we know that today, as these things evolve, we'll be ready to take advantage of what they can do in the future. But if we wait until that point, we're going to be behind the 8 ball. So that's my little spiel on the prompt design, prompt engineering side. So anything else to follow up with?
I mean, I'll jump in. So I think you've raised a few very interesting points. Now, I'll pick up on two. So on the point of bias, I absolutely agree on the concept of model bias. It's probably important to recognize a little bit that if we go back 2 years, of course, then these models were trained on a data corpus, and that data corpus was the internet. Now, with the internet, the English-speaking internet particularly, right, that's been generated from a handful of countries. It's been generated in the US and in the EU primarily. And if you start, because I do a lot of sort of international work as well, and if we start to go towards India and China, and we have translations from English scraped or English trained models, then there is going to be bias in the model, and it's not bias in the model of response. So the model will never tell you that I'm biased because I was trained on English language internet, but that's an inherent bias in the system. So we have both model aware bias and model unaware bias that we need to consider, and that's a cultural artifact a little bit. The second point that you made that made me think again, where you were talking about effectively moving towards a model of learning with AI versus working with AI, because those are kind of two different things. And if we think about learning is effectively a pre-activity. So you're going to do a thing, but you need to have a certain baseline of knowledge or a certain baseline of skill before you go and do that activity. And generally speaking, I think that the work of learning and development departments is, if everybody's familiar with normal distribution. So in a population, you have effectively a bell-shaped curve. And in the middle, you have, let's talk about performance, you have mean performance in the middle. And then as you move away from the mean, you have standard deviations from the mean. And at the end, you have outliers. Now, the outliers, the role of L&D isn't really to tackle those outliers, because if the outliers are poor performers, then that's an HR managerial issue to deal with. And if your outliers are your very high performers, then really get out of the way and let them do their thing, right? But the role of L&D really is to shift that mean, even if it's only 5 and 10%, so that the entirety of the 2 or 3 standard deviations from the mean, the bulk of the population, gets slightly better at something, whatever that thing is. Now we can tackle that with learning. So we can say, well, before you go and do a thing, you need to know something. You need to be more equipped with information. You need to have rehearsed or practiced some kind of skill. That could be a soft sort of power skill. It could be interpersonal interactions. It could be a technical skill. Go and practice some coding in a sandbox, whatever it happens to be. But on the other side, we could say, well, and there was a BCG study not long ago where they talked about this exact thing. But they were looking at the idea of, well, if you don't have any prior knowledge, if you don't have any prior skill, can you work on a task synergistically with an AI agent and try and find out the things by going back and forth in terms of prompting, trying to find out the things that allow you to perform that task optimally, where there is good task fit analysis. So the task fit analysis is, I've done some kind of analysis and I think, well, this particular task, AI is very suited for this task, and human oversight with AI doing the task is optimal. Or there's another task where humans are well suited to this task, but with a little bit of AI support, they can do that really well. So we think about those kinds of things, and then we have optimum performance without necessarily the presence of learning. You have people learning in the flow of work, which is the ideal that we've all been shooting for a while. And people working synergistically with some of these models to get good output in terms of data science or statistics or maybe even coding or something like that. So that's your comments prompted me to go down that road. And while I was talking, I saw a hand go up in the chat.
Yeah, I did see it as well. Paul Goddard, I think, raised his hand. Paul, did you want to raise a comment or a question?
goof on my part. Sorry. I am listening.
Did you have a question or a comment?
Oh, he said
Nope.
nothing. No.
Okay.
No, somebody's hand went up. Don't be shy. Put your hand up again if you have a comment.
And that's a great point. You mentioned, yeah, about using AI for work productivity type things versus AI for the learning. And that is very different. And no matter which way, but the learning one is really, as you said, so very important to make sure that we just don't drop them in front of it and say, there you go learn what you need to. No, it's got to be structured. It's got to be driven. And you're right, on the back side of it, collecting the data of the results. I deal with a lot of students on college campuses, and some college campuses are allowing AI, some are not. Most of the professors are saying, it's called cheating, which I hate to hear that because it's not cheating. It's that discussion. But I had a discussion with a professor one time, and he's like, I said, why won't you let students using it for research papers? He says, because I want them to keep it right. He wants them to be authentic, and I understand that. That makes sense. I said, but what if they're trying to research an idea and I show them how to challenge the engine, like challenge the engine on the ideas, have a back and forth, pull in different concepts, take the other side. Basically, in the end, they're looking for critical thinking. And the entire capture of this is the critical thinking process. Then they come back and say, here's what I've learned based on this process. I said, isn't that what you're capturing? Isn't that what you want them to do? I said, and they've got access to an incredible knowledge base. I won't say experts and everything, but they've got such information they can pull so quickly together. That's what we want to teach them to do. So haven't gotten the answer back from the professor yet on whether they'll start to accept that. But it's a bit more work. That's the hard part. It's more work because now you got to track all that down. But that's what the learning and development people are going to have to do, is how do you get the stuff that's coming out of there that they're taking to learn, and as you say, capture it, put metrics against it. Did they, the 4 Kirkpatrick levels? Yeah, did they really get to levels 3 and 4 using AI or not? I mean, we have a hard time capturing that data and understanding it in-person type training, or as you said, structured things we put in front of them and can capture. But really, how are we going to do that with AI? Because it's wide open. Yep.
So if you think about purpose just a little bit there, because enterprise learning and sort of cognitive development are two very different things. So enterprise learning and development probably we can segment into a couple of different things. So one is, let's call it training. So training is a different thing from learning. And training is a risk mitigation measure for a business to safeguard. It's a control mechanism. So we have a risk. We want to be able to demonstrate we've informed our staff about X, Y, and Z, the appropriate behaviors to take, whatever it happens to be. Then we have learning, where you expect some kind of cognitive, motivational, behavioral outcome. And then we have development, which is effectively moving towards the concept of self-actualization in the population. So they are slightly different things. And it's worth measuring the effects of interventions. So we say, well, an intervention that we spent money on has got a certain efficacy in the population. Whereas if we look at academic learning, so towards the pursuit of a qualification, for example, you're doing a degree, an advanced degree, whatever it happens to be, the emphasis is slightly different, because what effectively we want in our student population is that they have critically engaged with the material and they can understand it to the point where they can either apply what they've learned, or they can have an opinion. If we think about the softer or the social sciences, arts and humanities, have an opinion on something that has been borne out already in the literature. The debate's already happened to an extent. How do you add to that debate? Or the science has already progressed to an extent. How do you add to that? Now, some of the AI engines are, of course, literature versed. You have some kind of RAG system where they can access the literature and they can check for accuracy and things like that. So I think Perplexity and Scite and a few of these do that. But ultimately, it's not the same as engaging with the literature. So understanding what has gone on before, being able to scrutinize and reflect on it, that has a different purpose in academic pursuits than it does in enterprise learning. So I would say that they are slightly different things. And what I would probably want from my students is to have critically engaged to the extent that you understand the material, because otherwise we're certifying that they understand a particular domain. And effectively, if they don't, then that's a problem. So I do kind of see both sides of it.
Yeah, and But I'll say the interesting thing is, again, working with colleges and universities who are looking at what the world looks like next, because they're realizing 4-year degree programs are actually not really growing at the pace they need to. Was like 100 and some odd colleges in the United States have already closed this year, and there's going to be more coming. The micro credentialing concept. So the same thing's true. I understand what you're saying there. The question is that what it's going to look like in the future with all of these tools in our aspects? I understand that, but I think they're going to start to say, how does it look in a world where agents might be available to have those discussions? Agents who are the agent of, say, a critical piece of literature that is the entire literature with some type of agent on top of it, so yeah, it's going to change, and that's what we're all facing right now, where there's no easy answers. What will that critical thinking skill and engagement look like in the future, or what we're willing to accept, versus what it looked like years ago? I mean, Socrates would get people together, and in person, of course, because he didn't have virtual back then, and do stuff and talk about things. And before written books, there were people who'd had discussions, but no real written process until Gutenberg really helped books become so popular, because he found a way to print more rapidly. Anyway, so yeah, it's society changes as we get these technologies, but I think we all recognize this technology is going to fundamentally change how we work, learn, operate, and we've got to continue to stay on top to figure out what that's going to look like.
So there are a couple of points in there which I find really interesting. So if you think about, and it comes a little bit to this idea of prompt engineering that you were talking about, the fundamentals of what you've just mentioned, the great philosophers of our ages, they and what you would do in an advanced degree. So you would formulate a research question, you would go and find out the answer to that, and then you would structure your answer, right? So the idea of, I know how to ask a question and I know how to formulate an answer, and I know how to tell whether this is a good answer or it isn't. That still applies to things like prompt engineering,
Sure.
because structuring that question is is slightly different with these agents, and this is your field more than mine.
Yep.
So the question becomes a little bit, what skills do we now need? If the technology has changed, is the process of asking a question still the same? And I would say that it probably isn't, because we're talking about prompt engineering, which is slightly different.
Yep.
But if you don't know what to ask, you need a certain amount, a sort of a level of foundational knowledge and foundational information to be able to ask a question that's going to give you a structured response, I think.
Yep, absolutely. And that's the part I think is going to change. You're right. We're all still trying to solve the stuff, but the question will be, how do we do it? And you're right. It just the issue is that AI opens up the whole world. But you're right. The question is that actually for better or worse for us? Because we might be getting shallow level answers and accepting those, versus saying, no, I'm going to dig deeper to see, are there better answers than this? Yep.
And I think I've seen a lot of that. I think that there's, I have a fairly cursory answer, therefore that's good enough. And then
Yes.
do I
Yep.
need to get any deeper?
Yep.
And I think it goes back to this idea that I was saying of purpose. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve? Because I think back to this idea of training versus learning, right? In a lot of what L&D departments are doing, it's probably rare that we're achieving something that is mastery level. Compared to, for example, you go through a PhD, or you go through a postdoc, or you go and invent something, or you're a lead engineer somewhere, right? These things are unlikely to be achieved by traditional sort of L&D departments. They require practice, they require experience, they require more deep and independent learning to go along with that. So I think in the spectrum that we're talking about, i.e., how do we use AI effectively in corporate learning? I think, dare I say, that a lot of the time, maybe our 80% answer might be sufficient for developing an e-learning course, or developing a face-to-face intervention, or something like that. So proportionality, I think, is important.
I think Bernie has some questions.
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
a
Bernie,
couple of questions queued up for you guys to kind of close us out today. So in the world of personalization and engagement, how can AI be leveraged to create a more personalized learning experience that will ultimately keep the employees engaged and motivated?
Paul, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I'll say from the design level and stuff, that's one of the advantages AI gives us, because as someone who's run larger L&D shops in a large organization, you still only have so much staff. There's only so much time and things. And so if someone came to me and say, hey, we need to design a learning journey that's perfect for each individual and stuff, I look at it and say, okay, we've got 12,000 individuals. How are we going to do that? I've got maybe 12 people in my entire L&D that do everything. So that wasn't possible, really. But today, if we train the model with our concept of what we have available for training, our culture, what we want people to go through and where they are, their skills, abilities, all this, if we've got all that data and we can get it in the engine, we can very quickly put together those very personalized learning journeys. And I think that's what's going to be a big change for us, is these systems will allow us to do that more rapidly and allow them to track where they are. Dealing with one the other day, a company called Mattermore, that's starting this thing of tracking your progress through coaching, one-on-one, everything else, all of that data being captured in an engine, and the engine can interact with you and your leader. That's going to change how we do this, because we're going to have that capability. Now, turn it over to Dr. Mehta, who can say, how does that work from, sort of the data or the structure side? There's the question.
So I'm going to say the controversial thing that nobody ever wants to hear, right? Because I love doing that. So the controversial thing that nobody ever wants to hear is you cannot personalize learning if you don't have personal data.
Yes.
We talk about this almost. I've had so many questions about this over the last probably 6 months, maybe 12 months, that you can customize, and it's a different word. Customize is a very different word to personalize. And you can customize by role, you can customize by geography, because it's easy to get that kind of data. We know what this role is. We have a job description, we've got a profile, we know roughly what they need to know. You can customize by geography, language, localization, all of these kinds of things. But the chances of, if you're making content, no matter how good your AI tools are, you're going to be making a subset of content. So I'm going to make a video, it's going to be about sales. I'm going to make another video, it's going to be about sales, but it's going to be in German instead of English, right? And that's going to serve a particular market. And then I'm going to make a role about operations. That's not going to serve the sales people, that's going to serve the operations people. But when you get right down to the individual level, you would need to collect fairly deep data on how I speak, how I respond to things, what the language is that I use, potentially my age, my ethnic background, maybe my gender. You'd need to collect all of this stuff and then have some mechanism of translating that data into something that's meaningfully going to speak to me as an individual, and that's going to produce a key thing that's going to produce a slightly different learning outcome, because that data matches the thing that I want to see. Now, this has been debunked so many times in the learning styles field, right? What are learning styles, and do they have any efficacy when it comes to learning outcomes if you match the learning intervention with the style, right? This has been borne out in the literature. So I don't think personalization is necessarily a thing we can do unless we have deep individual personal data. And social media has demonstrated that we can do that, right? But in the L&D space, I don't think we can do it because we don't have that quality of data.
And I
So
think
I'll pause my answer there, and Bernie, just direct your eyes to, we have a Q&A in the Q&A bit.
So Bruce asked, earlier you mentioned the reality of enterprise learning, measuring ROI. With more self-learning today, how do we measure ROI and keep our jobs? API won't do it. Measuring improved efficiency is still hard. Teaching learners to be self-sufficient in prompt engineering is a start. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, shall I take this one and then pass the poll? So
Yes, absolutely.
So I think measuring ROI is something that L&D departments have nearly always found difficult to do, and that's because L&D departments measure two things. They do one very well, and they do the other one fairly badly. Now, the one thing that L&D departments tend to measure very well is we have intake, we have requests, we have things that we make, we have interventions that we deliver, we have people that come to those interventions, we have click-through rates, we have time-stamped activity on our LMS, and then therefore we say, well, we had this much money, we made this many things, and this many people interacted with those things. So that's web traffic, that's click-through, that's attendance. It's not really the same as cognitive output, motivational or behavioral output. So measuring that is almost bread and butter for L&D departments. They're very good at it, and you can measure against those things. But those things are not the same as ROI. So when we think about ROI, what we're saying is at a business level, not at L&D level, at a business level, we have enterprises, companies that are investing money. They're investing money for the sake of competitive advantage. We want to have something that differentiates us from our competitors in the marketplace. That means that we get a better share of the market, we get better revenue, we get better sales volume, we get better quality, whatever it is, some kind of measure that matters to the business. Now, these are not L&D measures, these are operational measures. And generally speaking, if we look to the world of data science, let's also look to the world of academia or any kind of scientific discipline. You would say we're going to do A/B testing. We're going to say group A got the intervention, group B didn't get the intervention. Was there a difference between the two in terms of operational output, in terms of metrics that actually matter to the business? Or we're going to do t-testing, or we're going to do pre and post testing, or we're going to do time series measurements. We have a number of interventions and people got better over time because they were rehearsing and rehearsing and rehearsing. So I don't see this as that difficult, but it requires a lot of work. So it requires not only to actually measure the interventions in terms of something that matters to the business, but it also requires having a model that goes from money invested in learning interventions through some behaviors to things that actually matter to the business. Can you correlate $1 spent on a learning intervention to X dollars increase in revenue? That data model is not easy to build, but it's something that if you put the time in, you can tease out those factors because most companies measure that kind of thing. So I would say the focus of ROI should nearly always be on operational rather than L&D outputs or metrics. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, it's pretty much, and the only thing I'll add is, sometimes the metric on the outside is to decrease expenses too, which, can be just as much as the increase revenue. Or I get a lot of this pushback too in the nonprofit space. It's like, they're not after profits, but you've been given a pile of money to have an outcome, and how well can you drive that outcome with the money? So it doesn't matter what the goal is, but you're right, tying that, and that's one of the things I say to people a lot in HR. You've got to be a good business person, because tying what you're trying to do, no matter what it is, you've got to tie it to that business outcome. If my talent acquisition team's doing something different, I got to make sure it's going to help us decrease time to fill a role, because we know it takes money the longer your role's open. Same thing in the learning and development space. It's really tying to that business outcome. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Bruce, I hope that answers the question. Feel free to pop a follow-up into the chat or Q&A if you'd like. I think we have time really for about one more question. We'll give folks a few more minutes back in their day. We touched on the idea of biases and ethics within using AI. So what steps should organizations take to ensure that AI tools used in training programs are as free from bias as possible and align with the ethical guidelines that are set?
Yeah, I think Dr. Mehta said that. Yeah, he said that earlier, and that is, if you're going to use a tool from a vendor, you've got to push that vendor to understand where they got their data, how they trained it, what they did for programming, and we're kind of lacking that right now. There are, in the talent acquisition space, there are laws already. New York City is one of the ones that has that says you have to identify if you're going to use it to make decisions on hiring, promotions, any of that type of terminations. You've got to show that, and of course they got companies that are on the list, but they're not forcing them, because right now most vendors can't tell you that information. They don't have that. So I think the key is going to be creating those standards, and I know the EU's trying it with legislation, is really coming together and creating standards to say, how do we identify where the data comes from, what it's got. As I said, we're never going to remove biases. I mean, there's no zero-sum game on it. You can't remove everything because there's always going to be some type of bias built into data sets or our thoughts and ideas. The question is to minimize them, understand them, minimize them, and then not use them in decision making that has an impact, especially on people. So I think the biggest thing that's going to happen there is really getting our arms around. And I'm not a big, regulate AI. I'm not saying we should regulate AI. We should really, though, put guardrails around what is it, where did it come from, and how are we using it. That's the part I do believe we've got to get our hands around. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think bias is one part of the equation, and I think generally speaking, the nebulous we in society, right? We use the terms ethics and governance very interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So what Paul has very rightly said is that models should, manufacturers and suppliers should disclose where their data came from. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And from a user perspective, you can think about using various models and testing them out and seeing which ones give you something that's more in keeping with your organizational policies or your organizational stance on things. But it's also worth thinking about the bias in your own prompts, right? Because you will have personal bias that reflects in the language that you use, because language is the vehicle of discourse, and it reflects everything that we have built up culturally over time. And so but that's bias. That's not the same as ethics. Ethics is a much broader question. And one of the things we should probably think about in the human capital space, whether it's L&D or whether it's more organizational development, is if we're implementing tools, how are we thinking about or impacting workforce displacement? So I'm going to bring in a tool that's an AI coach tool, right? Does that mean now I need to get rid of all of my coaches? Tools have an impact, or interventions in technology have an impact on the workforce and have an impact on jobs. So that would be more of an ethics question to think about that. And the other side would be, well, we're going to think about the source of our data, and we're going to think about copyright and our stance on copyright, or we're going to think about our stance on sustainability and the energy burden that comes from using large language models compared to doing a Google search, right? So all of these things would be part of our governance structure. And to some degree, it does depend on your organizational policies and what your organizational stance is on these things.
Good. Thank you, gentlemen. All right. We are 5 minutes to the top of the hour. Any additional closing comments that you guys want to make, or shall we wrap?
Paul, do you want to go? I'll make a closing statement, but
Just
you
go
go
ahead.
first.
Yep. Make a closing one. Yep. Go ahead.
I think the thing I'd like to say in closing is that it's a confusing and scary world where you see AI being bandied around all the time, and it's not always functional. Sometimes it's just a marketing tool that someone's saying, I have an AI powered coffee cup, please buy it, right? So you need to differentiate between what is signal and what is noise. But I think everybody here can kind of be aware that if you have a purpose and you go and search for something that's going to fulfill your purpose, then the chances are you're on the right track because you're trying to solve your problem by applying critical thinking and applying kind of research and first principles. So if anybody is put off or fearful or scared about playing with tools and reaching out to the market and trying to figure out what the landscape is, think about first principles and take those pragmatic steps to play with the things that are going to solve your problems.
And I totally agree. In fact, that was kind of the way I was going to wrap up too, is if you are that fearful, the biggest thing you can do, as you mentioned, is just I call it start simple, but really follow people, listen to people who are giving practical information. And I think, you and I are sort of some of the ones that are doing, there's a lot of them out there. But to get past the hype, because there's a lot of hype and there's going to continue to be hype, but really find the people who are practical about it and bringing up good ideas and follow them, listen to them, ask them for advice. I think that's how you're really, especially in the HR space, you're really going to get better at this. Is don't ignore it. Please don't ignore it, because it's not going to go away. And the further you wait, the longer you're going to be behind that 8 ball. So I do say, I think the biggest thing is find people you trust and ask them questions, learn from them. So.
Gentlemen, thank you again both for agreeing to be here today. I appreciate the time and effort and energy you've put into this, and the information that you've shared. So for those of you who've joined us today, that will conclude our webinar. However, I do encourage you to please reach out to Dr. Mehta or Paul if you have any follow-up questions that you'd like answered or some support with. And of course, if Insignia can help you in any way, shape, or form with your learning and development needs, please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, I would like to close the webinar and say, please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.